Dry wind rattled the boards of the lonely general store as Amos Crowley stepped inside, his spurs clinking in cautious rhythm. He had not come to buy food or ammunition. Tonight, he came for something he never expected to crave. The storekeeper, an aging man named Finnegan, looked up from wiping the counter. His gaze flicked to Amos's broad-shouldered silhouette, rimmed by lantern light. "Evenin', Amos," Finnegan said quietly, voice thick with the hush of decades. "Heard something on the wire." Amos offered a stiff nod, gloved hands cradling an envelope. The brass seal glinted in the dim. "That's the one." He slid it across. Within was catalogued promise, an advertisement he'd once scrolled past like a wrinkle in the wind. "Mail-order brides," the ad had said, and some had laughed. Town gossip dripped like poison, girls returned, letters left unanswered. Men whispered of mistakes and heartbreak, but he had answered anyway. He took a chance. Finnegan's eyes softened, understanding not pity but cautious hope. "You read her letter." Amos exhaled. He had line after line of a small-town girl's script, the ink shaky but determined. She described sun-turned hair, hands hardened from sewing dresses, heart naked from loss. Amos had read it beneath his canvas tent one lonely dawn, heart trudging through distant memories. The wind tugged at lonely corners. The words kindled something boxed deep in him, something like faith. He paused at the door, lantern light throwing long shadows across dusty shelves. "I'll wait. West Ridge Station, midnight train." He nodded and left without fuss. Outside, the prairie stretched silent, except for a lone coyote's shrill chord. He mounted his chestnut mare, Belle, and headed for home, each stride steeped in something unnameable. Back at his isolated homestead, three battered structures sprawling beneath the sky, Amos untethered Belle and walked inside his cabin. Moonlight bled through cracks in the shutter. He lit a solitary lamp. On the table lay two whiskey glasses. He poured for himself and for the seat across, feeling his pulse shiver with anticipation. The domestic quiet of the old cabin felt foreign. He ran a finger across the rim of an empty glass. Just minutes ago, he had imagined her silhouette stepping off the train, dress swaying, hesitant gaze tracing the unfamiliar horizon. Would she be frightened? Would she regret leaving everything behind? At the very least, he told himself they would meet. That mattered. Midnight's hush gathered like a congregation in corners of the room. Amos watched the door, breath anchoring in his chest. He fingered the envelope again. Outside, a squeal of wheels, heart clamped. He grabbed his coat, stepped into the night. At the station, steel tracks gleamed under lanterns strung on poles. The train's whistle roared and the caboose door swung down. He spotted her silhouette before she did, tall, slender, wrapped in a shawl. Hat brim low, she took cautious steps. She paused, eyes lifting at the sound of his name. Amos swallowed. She was more fragile than the portrait he held in memory, but her gaze, clear, unwavering, met his. He offered the envelope and his glove. She slipped out of the train's shadow and into his waiting presence. Belle whickered softly behind him. He offered the hand. "Afternoon, I'm Amos." She placed her small, gloved hand in his. "Lee Hart," she said, voice steady, though perhaps quivering at the edges. Her first word on this foreign soil. Belle shifted impatiently. Amos cleared his throat. "Your things are at the homestead." Tension flared in Lee's shoulders. She nodded once. "Yes." He lifted a small trunk she carried, its painted wood chipped but intact. She stared at him silently as they walked toward the horse, the train's whistle fading into memory and the open prairie reclaiming its dominion. Back on the ranch, Belle led the way through overgrown yard. Amos guided Lai, trunk in hand. The cabin door swung open and the warm lamplight revealed sparse furnishings, plank tables, peeling wallpaper, the stove black with soot. Lai's chest tightened. She set her trunk down just inside, her eyes darting between wood floors and bare walls. It's simple, Amos said quietly, but it'll keep you safe. She turned and looked at him, admiration mixed with fear. Thank you. Her small voice filled the emptiness. Outside, wind rustled. The night pressed down in quiet intensity. Two lives carried by obligation, chance, and loneliness waited for dawn. Amos closed the door, stepping beside her. She exhaled slowly, tracing chipped paint. I'm sorry if it's not. Home. Amos watched her, his own voice rough with something like wonder. It'll be together. No one else had wanted her, too plain, too quiet, too much sorrow in her letters. They had refused her the way townspeople refused to look at things they didn't understand. He accepted. Something in that acceptance flared bright inside him. For the moment, that was enough. A faint coyote call drifted in. Lee pressed a hand to the wall, taking it in. Her lips parted, a tremor of emotion. She looked up at Amos, whose eyes glimmered in the lamplight. Their new life had begun. Lee awoke to silence so thick it pressed against her chest. The wind had gone still in the night, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. Her borrowed bed creaked as she rose, the cotton quilt tangled at her knees. She moved slowly, unsure if she was a visitor or something more permanent. The cabin was hushed, empty of Amos, and lit dimly by a shaft of morning sun cutting across the floorboards. She found the pump outside and washed her face in water cold enough to bite. The pump's iron handle groaned under her grip. From the corral came a low snort. Amos was saddling Belle, jaw tight, coat unbuttoned. He didn't look up as she approached. I figured I'd see to the cattle, he said. Lee smoothed the damp strands of hair at her temple. Would you like help? Amos paused. His eyes met hers, blue-gray, unreadable. You ever worked stock? She shook her head. He gestured toward the barn. Then start with the coop. The hens are worse than drunks in a saloon if you leave 'em too long. She nodded and turned without another word, skirts brushing against the wild grass. Amos watched her go. She didn't complain, didn't shrink, and something in that quiet grit knotted inside him. He swung into the saddle and rode out. Inside the coop, Lee grimaced at the sharp stink of straw and feathers. One hen pecked at her boot as if testing her right to exist. She took a breath and reached under the perch, fingers brushing warm eggs. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the unfamiliar. This life, this role, this man who had chosen her when no one else had. By midday she had swept the porch, boiled coffee, and chopped onions with a dull blade. Her hands were nicked. Her back ached. But when Amos returned, dust on his boots and sweat beneath his collar, the table was set with beans, bread, and a meager plate of jerky. He stood there quiet, hat in hand. You didn't have to. I wanted to. He sat slow, the way a man sits after riding hard. They ate in silence, spoons scraping ceramic. The wind had returned, carrying the far-off sound of hooves or maybe just memory. Amos cleared his throat. You got people back east. No, she took a sip of the bitter coffee. They're gone, fever last winter. He watched her face. She didn't cry, didn't soften. You. Amos nodded. Lost my brother to rustlers. Parents before that, been alone since. They finished the meal without more talk. That night, Amos slept in the barn, saying nothing of it. Lee lay in the cabin alone, staring at the timber beams above. In the quiet, she began to stitch, each thread a prayer, each knot a memory. Days folded into each other like pages turned slow. Lee learned the land, how the wind meant rain or warning, how to read the cattle's mood, how to chase the chickens back with a rusted pan. Amos spoke little but always noticed. When she mended the curtain, when she dug the stubborn weed out by the porch, when she covered the leaky patch of roof with waxed cloth. One evening she caught him watching her across the yard. The light was gold on the grass. She stood at the clothesline, sheets snapping in the breeze. He approached slowly, like nearing a wild animal. I never expected you, stay. She tied a corner and turned to him. I gave you my word. That don't mean much to most folks. I'm not most. They stood there a long while, until the sun dipped and the air cooled. Then Amos nodded once and walked away, boots crunching gravel. That night, thunder rolled in. The wind clawed at the windows, and the shutters banged until Amos hammered them shut. Lee stood at the hearth, hair unbound, the lamp flickering between them. Storm'll last till morning, he said. Barns locked, stocks fed. She nodded, her hands gripped her shawl. Amos looked at the narrow cot. I can take the floor. No, she said, then softer, stay, it's cold. He hesitated, then removed his coat, boots settled at the edge of the bed. They lay side by side, the silence louder than any thunder. She whispered, did they laugh at you? For answering. He turned his head toward her. They laugh at quiet men in loud towns. She smiled barely. They laughed at me too. Outside, lightning cracked the sky open like a promise. Inside, two strangers laid beside each other, not touching, yet somehow changed. The prairie, indifferent to love or loss, roared on. But inside that crooked cabin, something began. Not passion, not yet, but the fragile root of belonging. Something not bought or demanded, only built. The snow came early that year, a heavy smothering kind that silenced even the coyotes. It fell across the plains in sheets, clinging to every fence post and window pane. Amos and Lee watched it from opposite sides of the cabin, both pretending the cold didn't seep deeper than their bones. The fire spat quietly. Lee stood with her hands wrapped around a chipped cup, the bitter dregs of chicory coffee pooling at the bottom. Amos leaned against the window frame, his hat low. Neither spoke. They had lived in the cabin for almost 4 months now. The space between them had narrowed, but only just. They moved like a pair of ghosts orbiting one another, each bound by necessity, each haunted by what they'd lost before the other arrived. When the storm passed, Amos saddled Belle and rode to town. Supplies were thinning and the roof had sagged under snow weight. Lee stayed behind, shoveling paths through the drifts, the wind slicing her cheeks. Her fingers ached as she worked, but she didn't stop. There was no one else. He returned after dusk with a satchel of grain, nails, and a packet wrapped in butcher paper. She met him at the door, her face windburned, hair frayed from the scarf. Amos handed her the paper wordlessly. She peeled it open to reveal thick wool, deep green, nearly black in the firelight. A coat, he said you'd need better for what's common. Lee stared at the fabric, throat tight. You didn't have to. Didn't want you to freeze. They didn't touch, didn't smile, but something passed between them like a held breath. Days bled into one another. They built a rhythm, a quiet discipline. Lee learned how to stack the wood so it wouldn't rot, how to salt meat in the cellar, how to read the sky. Amos began to leave her notes, short, scrawled things. Feed the sow, don't go east, tracks by the ravine. Boil more water for tomorrow. He didn't say her name often, but when he did, it sounded like a vow. One afternoon, the dog appeared, stray, limping, ribs like fence slats. Lee found it curled beneath the porch, shivering. She coaxed it out with bread and wrapped it in a feed sack. Amos watched from the barn, face unreadable. What'll you name it? He asked that night, voice low. Nothing, Lee said. It's just hungry. Amos nodded, then added scraps to the dog's bowl. It followed her after that, always at her heel, sleeping at her door. She still hadn't named it, but Amos caught her whispering to it in the dark. It was in February when the sickness came, not fever, worse, something in the lungs, dry and hot and endless. Lee woke to the sound of Amos coughing blood into the hearth ashes. She ran to him, panicked. His hands pushed her away. Don't, he rasped. It'll pass. But it didn't. She boiled water until her skin split. She spooned broth between his cracked lips, wiped sweat from his brow. Days passed in a blur of wet cloth and prayers murmured without faith. The dog lay guard at the door. He nearly died. Then one night, as snow fell soft against the glass, Amos opened his eyes and whispered, "Lee." She froze. Her name on his lips sounded unlike anything she'd heard, soft, reverent, scared. "I'm here," she said. His hand gripped hers, rough fingers trembling. "Don't leave." "I won't," she answered, and this time it was a promise carved deep. When spring came, Amos could walk again, but slower. He leaned on the porch rail and watched her hammer a fence post, hair tied back, sleeves rolled. The dog ran beside her in wide loops. "You fixed the coop," he said one evening. She nodded, brushing dirt from her skirt. "You were sleeping." "Couldn't let the foxes win." Amos looked at her then, not just at her face, but all of her. The strength in her shoulders, the quiet in her gaze, not a stranger anymore, not a burden. "Lee," he said again, and this time she turned fully to him. "Yes. I meant it when I said don't leave." She took one step closer, the dog between them, the wind warm with the first breath of spring. "I know," she said. That night they shared the bed without space between. No kiss, no ceremony, just warmth and breath and the knowledge of having endured together. The cabin held its breath as if afraid to disturb what had finally begun to settle into place. Outside, the snow melted into earth. Inside, two lives began to bloom. The rains came next. They swelled the rivers and turned wagon tracks to veins of mud, drowning the lowlands and soaking the land to its bones. At night, thunder echoed through the valley like judgment. The cabin groaned under the weight of it, but Amos and Leigh no longer flinched at storms. By now, they spoke more. Not often and never idly, but the words between them had grown roots. Lee would mention the spotted cow limping near the creek, and Amos would rise from his meal without a word, grab his tools, and go. He would find her hunched over new seeds by the porch and drop a folded paper in her lap. Notes on soil, where to plant, what to watch for. One morning, while dragging the hoe through wet rows of carrots, Lee paused. A low ache stirred in her belly, unfamiliar and deep. She brushed it off, kept working, but the feeling returned in days to come, then again and stronger. It wasn't sickness, it was something else. She waited a week before telling Amos. They stood in the barn as wind moaned outside, the scent of hay thick in the air. He was shoeing a colt, hammer poised midair when she spoke. "I think I'm with child." The hammer dropped. A sharp clang broke the silence. He looked at her, stunned, the words taking root slowly behind his eyes. "You sure?" She nodded, arms crossed to still the tremble. "I've seen the signs before, in others." Amos leaned on the bench, suddenly years older. "You afraid?" "Yes," she said. "And not just of what it means, but what it will take." He nodded once, jaw tight, and turned back to the colt. "We'll manage." She didn't weep, she didn't smile, but her hands shook as she picked straw from her sleeves. He didn't say more. He didn't need to, something had shifted. That spring, Amos worked harder than ever. He built a second fence line, repaired the roof properly, began carving a cradle from leftover pine. Lee caught him sanding the edge one evening, jaw clenched, hands sure. "You think it'll hold?" she asked. Amos looked up. "It has to." The months passed. Lee swelled with the child. The dog grew old and slow, sleeping by the fire now instead of chasing sparrows. The land greened, then dried again, but they held steady. Word from town came rarely, and they didn't seek it. News didn't matter much to people no longer watching clocks or calendars. Then came the riders, 3 of them, dust-bitten, drunk and grinning. They showed up late afternoon, shadows long behind them. One wore a Union coat, another a red bandana stained with God knows what. The last had a scar like a bolt of lightning down his cheek. Lee saw them first, out by the well. She dropped the bucket. Amos came out, rifle in hand but not yet raised. The one with the scar tipped his hat. Just passing through, thought we might share a drink. We don't share, Amos said. The second rider chuckled. That ain't neighborly. The first dismounted. His boots sank into the earth. Pretty place you've got. Pretty woman, too. Amos's voice dropped to a deadly quiet. Leave. Scarface stepped closer. You sure? Be a shame if something happened to... The rifle cracked once. A bird lifted from the cornfield. Scarface staggered, blood blooming at his sleeve. Not lethal, not yet. I said leave. They mounted up quick after that, spitting curses, galloping off toward the tree line. Lee stood frozen on the porch, hand at her belly. Amos turned slowly, eyes meeting hers. You all right? She nodded, pale. I'm fine. That night, she stood over the cradle he had built. Ran her hand across the smoothed wood, one finger tracing the edge. Outside, Amos paced the perimeter, rifle across his shoulder, boots pressing new lines into old soil. I'll protect you, he had said once. Now she knew he meant it. When dawn came, it brought no riders, only the sound of wind in grass and the slow beat of a land holding its breath. The storm had passed, for now. But Amos cleaned the rifle again anyway, eyes watchful, hands steady. Lee began sewing new clothes, tiny shirts and bonnets, her needle sharp and fast. Not a word was wasted between them. They were past the need for reassurance. The world had already tried to take everything. Now they would not let it. By late summer, the heat came like a blade. It shimmered off the dirt road, dried the last trickle of the creek, and turned the air into something mean and hard to breathe. Flies swarmed the stalls. The earth cracked wide like it too was thirsting. Lee moved slower now, every step measured. Her stomach heavy, her back aching, but her will sharper than ever. She worked in the mornings when the sun still cast long, forgiving shadows. Amos tried to stop her once. She ignored him. It calms me, she said. He didn't argue again. The dog died on a Tuesday, quietly beneath the shade of the barn. Lee found him stretched out, mouth open like he was still chasing something in sleep. She knelt beside him, one hand resting on the stiff fur. No tears, just a nod and later a grave behind the coop, small rocks marking the place. Amos dug it in silence. She watched from the porch. At night she began waking in pain, not the dull ache of labor coming soon, but a sharp, breath-snatching grip that left her hands clawing the mattress. Amos didn't sleep. He paced, fetched water, kept the shotgun loaded. The memory of those riders lingered like smoke in dry curtains. They weren't seen again, but Amos didn't believe in luck. He believed in preparation. One morning Lee didn't rise. Her breath came shallow, skin glazed with sweat. He found her curled in bed, hands pressed against her belly. It's time, she said. Amos's face tightened. Now. Now. He had prepared a dozen ways, laid cloth, boiled rags, read the old medical books passed to him by a trapper's widow 3 counties over. But when the time came, it all left him. He became a man of action and silence, fetching, steadying, bracing her as waves of pain tore through her body like fire. Hours passed. The sun dropped. Coyotes yowled. Lee screamed once, just once, and bit her own arm to keep it from happening again. Her fingers gripped Amos's shirt so tight she tore the seam. He didn't flinch, just wiped her brow, whispered the only word that mattered. Breathe. When the child came, it was red and wet and furious, fists balled against the cruelty of birth. Lee collapsed, vision graying. Amos cut the cord with shaking hands and wrapped the girl in the soft green cloth from the coat he'd bought her mother. He held her up to the lamp's glow and saw himself there, in the brow, the chin, but her eyes were Lee's. That same quiet storm, Lee stirred. Let me see. He placed the bundle in her arms. Her lips cracked into something like a smile, exhaustion giving way to awe. "She's strong," Amos said. "So she'll have to be," Lee replied. They named her Ruth. In the days that followed, the cabin changed. No longer just wood and roof, it began to breathe, to hum with new rhythm. A cradle rocked. Tiny cries split the night. Lee's footsteps softened, her strength returning slow and steady. Amos grew quieter, if such a thing was possible. But he watched more now, not just for danger, but for the shape of a future he hadn't dared to imagine before her. Then came the letter. It arrived with a passing peddler, grease-stained envelope, no return. Amos read it at the fence line while Lee nursed Ruth inside. His eyes darkened. He folded the letter and burned it in the fire without a word. But that night, as he lay beside Lee and their child slept within arm's reach, he whispered, "There's trouble coming." She turned to him, eyes alert. "From who?" "From before." He didn't say more, didn't need to. She knew enough of men and grudges to recognize what silence meant. In the morning, he began checking the traps along the ridge again, oil for the hinges, nails at the windows. He packed a revolver into the saddlebag. Lee didn't question. She fed Ruth and mended Amos's old coat. She knew what they had now was worth fighting for. Later that evening, she stepped outside and looked across the land. Wind in the tall grass, smoke curling from the chimney, the cradle creaking soft behind her. She didn't know when the trouble would come, but she knew it would. And when it did, she would not be the woman who arrived quiet off a midnight train. She would be something more. They came just after the frost returned, when the earth had hardened again and the leaves fell like whispers. 3 men, same as before, but this time they didn't smile. Their horses were leaner, coats slick with sweat, hooves caked in red clay from the canyon's south. And they rode with a purpose, not curiosity, not sport, vengeance. Amos saw them from the ridge where he'd been checking snares. He crouched low, counted the figures, recognized the scar on the lead rider's face. The blood Amos had drawn still marked the edge of his coat like a badge. Amos moved fast, cutting through the brush, rifle tight across his chest. He didn't rush, no panic, only calculation. By the time he returned, they were already at the gate. Lee stood on the porch, Ruth bundled against her chest. Her eyes were wide but not frightened. Amos had taught her the way of stillness. She knew where the extra shells were, knew how to slip the revolver from the hollow beneath the floorboards. Scarface dismounted. He looked thinner, hungrier. "You got something of mine," he said. Amos stood between him and the house. "You got a poor memory, son." The man smiled, teeth yellowed. "You took my pride last time. That bullet cost me more than blood. You think I'd forget? I hoped you might bleed out before remembering." That got a laugh from one of the others. But not Scarface. His hand twitched toward his belt. Lee took one step back toward the door. Ruth whimpered. Scarface's eyes flicked to the sound. "A baby now, huh? You made yourself a pretty little life. Shame you built it on borrowed ground." Amos didn't blink. "Ain't borrowed, paid for, earned." Scarface spat. "Not enough." The first shot rang before he finished the breath. It was Amos. It was Lee. From the cabin doorway, the revolver cracked once. The third man, lean, red bandana, too slow, fell sideways, clutching his neck. Blood pooled fast into the dirt. Chaos. Amos dropped to a knee and fired. Scarface's horse reared, screamed, and bolted. The second man scrambled for cover behind the trough, but Lee was already reloading, calm, methodical. Scarface ran for the barn. Amos followed, boots slicing into frost. Inside, they circled the stalls like wolves, both breathing hard. Scarface's pistol barked twice, splinters raining down. Amos flanked left, remembering the layout in silence, moving by instinct. They met by the ladder to the loft. The scuffle was brutal, fists, elbows, a flash of teeth. Scarface drove a knife into Amos's side, shallow but searing. Amos answered with the butt of his rifle, breaking cheekbone and sending the man sprawling into hay. Scarface coughed blood, eyes blazing. "You think you're better than us. You were nothing once." "I still am," Amos said, raising the rifle. The final shot silenced the barn. Outside, Lee held Ruth close, watching the horizon. The last rider had fled. She didn't chase, didn't speak, just waited. Amos emerged bloody but upright. Lee ran to him, pressed cloth to his wound. He winced but stood steady. Ruth cried once, then fell quiet. They buried the dead behind the shed. No markers, no words, just dirt. That night, Lee lit a fire higher than usual. Amos sat with a bottle untouched beside him. Ruth slept in the cradle, hands curled tight. "You didn't hesitate," he said. Lee looked at him. "I knew what I was fighting for." He took her hand, for the first time not with caution but with surety. "We keep going," he said. She nodded. "We always have." The wind knocked gently at the shutters. In the dark, the land turned inward again. Wounds reopened, justice rendered, silence returned, but the cabin stood strong, and inside something fierce endured. Spring returned with the smell of rain and iron. The land softened again, and the wind carried less threat, more promise. Ruth was walking now, unsteady steps across the porch, fists gripping Amos's trousers as she laughed without knowing what danger was. Lee watched her with a gaze that had learned not to trust peace, but to guard it. The graves behind the shed settled into the earth. Weeds grew up through the mounds. No one spoke of that winter anymore, but the bullet scars in the barn remained. Lee never removed them. She passed them often with Ruth on her hip, running her hand across the wood. She never said why. Amos's wound healed, though slower than he let on. He limped more in the mornings and took longer to saddle Belle. But his grip stayed strong, his aim sharper than before. He taught Ruth how to whistle through her fingers and how to hush when danger was near. Not yet old enough to understand, but learning all the same. Lee stitched a new dress from scrap linen and taught herself to shoot with her left hand, just in case. She rode out farther now, checking traps and clearing brush, Ruth bundled behind her in a shawl tied tight across her back. Town folk said they'd seen a woman out by the gulch, gun on her hip, baby swaddled like a general's flag. They whispered about the Crowley place again, but not with scorn this time, with caution. That summer a rider came, this one different. Clean coat, government seal on his saddlebag, Union war pin still polished. He brought news of a land claim settled in their favor. The homestead, once disputed, was now theirs by law. Signed and sealed, Lee read the paper twice, then set it down beside the cradle. Took them long enough. Amos said nothing, only nodded. For him, it was never about paper. It was about blood and roots, things deeper than ink. In the following weeks, others came. A widow from south of Ridge Hollow asking how Lee kept her livestock safe from wolves. A boy from town offering to mend the fence for eggs and a place to sleep. One morning, an old preacher stopped at the gate, asked if the girl had ever been blessed. Lee stared at him a long time. "She's been covered in mud, blood, and fire," she said. "If that ain't a blessing, I don't know what is." He tipped his hat and left. Amos built a second cabin in the field beyond the orchard. Smaller, sturdier, in case Ruth wanted it one day, or in case they ever had more. The thought lingered, not spoken, but carried in the way his eyes lingered on Lee when she worked, or how she touched her belly sometimes without realizing it. They were older now, both of them, but not yet done. One morning, Lee woke before the sun and stepped outside barefoot. The sky was streaked with red and gold. Ruth slept inside. Amos snored low and steady in the cot. She stood in the grass, feeling the dew kiss her skin. The fields rolled out before her like scripture. Everything had changed. She had been a cast-off girl in a list of unwanted names. He had been a man too quiet for the world's noise. Together they had built something raw and real, not perfect, not soft, but alive. She bent down, plucked a stalk of wild mint, and pressed it between her fingers. From the cabin, Ruth's cry rose like a morning bell. Lee turned, walking back into the light. She had come west with nothing but a letter, a name, and a will to survive. Now she had land, a child, a man who bled beside her, a life no one else could have built, not because they were chosen, but because they chose each other. And they would keep choosing again and again for as long as the prairie ran wide beneath their feet.